Good afternoon, this is BBC News. We start with some breaking news which has occurred in the last few minutes that Russian long-range missiles have struck the Polish city of Przemyśl. A Kremlin spokesperson came out immediately after the impact to deliver a statement on the strike saying, quote, "Moments ago, several missiles of ours impacted Przemyśl, a city in eastern Poland, and close to the Ukrainian border. We entirely deny that this was intentional. These missiles were programmed to strike Lviv as part of our ongoing long-range strategic missile campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure. However, several miscalculations during the firing of these missiles took them off course and into Polish airspace, regrettably striking Polish territory. We must insist that this was not an intentional strike whatsoever, and stand willing to help with any efforts to repair the damage caused, which is currently unknown to us. On behalf of the Russian Federation, we would like to wholeheartedly apologize to the people of Poland for this tragic miscalculation, and our thoughts are with anyone caught in the impact of the strikes. We understand this kind of strike may be deemed intentional by the European NATO powers, as well as the United States of America, however we urge you not to escalate. This was an accidental event which will be atoned for. We understand this was our error and we will take ownership of that misstep, however, we will not allow this incident to be used by the warhawks in Great Britain, Germany, and the USA to provoke a wider conflict. Do not escalate the situation. We are currently waiting for official news on the amount of damage caused in the missile strikes, as well as formal statements from Polish officials and world officials alike. Unconfirmed rumors on the ground from Przemyśl have stated that as many as 120 people may have been caught in these missile strikes, with a number of those being fatalities. Although these numbers are yet unconfirmed, world media and leaders alike have been reacting to the statements by Russia with a mix of surprise and anger. The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, moments ago stated on X, quote, "The Russian missile attack on the Polish city of Przemyśl is yet another example of Russian terrorism. Their apology is just words and not sincere. It is time for the West to realize Russia is a threat to world peace. NATO must act. The time has come." Zelenskyy, whose nation has been in open war with the Russians since February 2022, and in broader conflict with the Russians since 2014, has been extremely outspoken in the need for NATO involvement in the war in Ukraine. However, senior NATO leaders have been hesitant to provide military assistance to the Ukrainians in case it is perceived by the Russians as a direct attack, and thus the possibility of a further escalation would then skyrocket. Polish President Karol Nawrocki has also released a statement on X in the past few moments. He said, quote, "Polish emergency services are currently rushing to aid all caught in the missile strikes in Przemyśl. The Republic of Poland will announce an official statement in due time, but for now we are focused on the well-being of our people. The Polish armed forces are on full alert." Sources from the BBC embedded within Poland itself can now also confirm that the deployment of Polish troops to the borders of the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad and the border with Belarus are beginning to take place. Kaliningrad, what used to be the German area of East Prussia, lays to the north of Poland, sandwiched in between Poland and the Baltic states. The area provides a key port for the Russians within the Baltic Sea. Belarus, which has been a practical puppet of the Russian Federation for many years now, has not to this point committed any form of hostility towards Ukraine or NATO during the time the war in Ukraine has been taking place. However, there is always the possibility of the Russians dragging Belarus into the conflict to open a northern flank towards Kiev for Russian troops to pass through. Whether this mobilization by Polish troops is a prelude for a future military conflict or just a safeguarding and posturing measure is currently unclear. We have now received a response from the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, on X. The Prime Minister wrote, quote, "The situation in Poland is a grave threat to world stability. Russia can no longer act without repercussions. The UK, along with our allies in the coalition of the willing, stand ready to deploy troops to Poland and Ukraine as a peacekeeping deterrent. Putin must be stopped now." Starmer has long been an advocate for British and wider Western involvement in Ukraine, however the lack of American backing for physical involvement has left the Prime Minister's position in limbo. Starmer, who is the driving force behind the so-called coalition of the willing, has long stated that British troops could and should be stationed within the borders of Ukraine to deter the Russians from further advances. However, many in the UK, especially the wider British public, believe this to be a sort of warmongering stance, and do not want Britain involved in any physical war in Europe. Those close to the Prime Minister and the government, however, will claim this is something which must be done to defend the independence of Ukraine, and to safeguard the lives of citizens on both sides of the war. Starmer previously stated that the goal of the coalition was to station troops within Ukraine once a peace deal had been formalized to confirm that peace lasts. However, with his statement that British troops are ready to deploy to Poland as well as Ukraine, are we now seeing a more active shift from the Prime Minister towards a physical involvement in this conflict? American President Donald Trump has just also released a statement on X. He said moments ago, quote, "I've just been alerted to the disaster which happened in Poland. A terrible tragedy of Russia's making. The war must end. The United States stands firmly on the side of the free world and always will. I urge you, Vladimir, stop now. The risk of escalation has never been higher." The president clearly urging Russian President Vladimir Putin to stop due to the risk of escalation, however, a much more measured approach from the American president than what has been seen from the Prime Minister. Donald Trump may be trying to keep a lid on this and stop the situation from exploding. We'll have to see how it develops over the coming days. A formal meeting between the designated leaders of the so-called coalition of the willing and the President of the United States, Donald Trump, took place earlier today, in which several key issues were discussed. President Trump strongly declared in the presence of leaders from across Europe that the United States, quote, "will not be dragged into any war which can be solved at the meeting table." President Trump also said that the European leaders are underestimating the volatility of the situation in Ukraine, and that the possibility of a nuclear exchange between the major powers of the world is a real threat if, quote, "unneeded players are added to the game." The President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, supported by Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and Karol Nawrocki, stated that the threat Russia poses to not just Ukraine but the Western world is existential, and that if Putin isn't stopped soon in Ukraine, quote, "you can bet he will go for the Baltics, for the Caucasus, Scandinavia, anywhere he can grasp." There was an awkwardly tense atmosphere within the meeting room amongst the leaders, with some European diplomats leaving extremely frustrated with the way the situation developed. A spokesperson, who wished to remain anonymous, said to a BBC reporter earlier that, quote, "the Americans don't understand how it feels to be in Eastern Europe with Russia. Even most of Western Europe doesn't realize it. America decided to be the bulwark in NATO, to replace the British as the global policeman, but now doesn't want to police when the situation is escalating. There is a real feeling amongst some of us that we need to go our own way. Europe needs to rearm once again and deal with our own issues. No one else is going to." Anthony Parkin, a spokesperson on behalf of the UK government who was present during the meeting, earlier told the BBC, quote, "It did get tense, we can't deny that. However, that's good, we're all so passionate about the situation. A level head can see both sides, that of the European perspective, and that of the American. No one wants escalation. It's about finding that balance. That is what the Prime Minister, the American President, and the rest of the leaders here today are desperately trying to achieve." Other topics discussed was the possibility of conscription being implemented across Europe, including in the UK, and whether conscripted soldiers would be a strong enough posture against Russia to stop their advance. Needless to say, the idea of conscription will definitely not be popular amongst the general population. In response to this meeting earlier today, Alexander Timov, a spokesperson for the Kremlin, released a statement on behalf of the Russian government stating, quote, "The Russian military considers the entirety of Ukraine a war zone. Any combatants present in that zone will be considered hostile to the Russian forces and will be at risk. Our troops will not discriminate when at war. Russia will not be held responsible if any Western soldier who enters the war zone of Ukraine is hurt or killed. As far as we are concerned, we have issued the warning. If you go through with it, your soldiers will be treated the same as the Ukrainians, as hostile actors against the Russian Federation. We urge you not to get caught in the crossfire." Whether the Russian warning to the West is heeded is unclear, but with tensions rising by the second, it seems a boiling point is not far off. Currently, millions of British people are marching through the capital to protest against the implementation of conscription by the British government. The controversial Modern Act of Conscription was passed last week, which allows the government the power to press into military service any British-born male between the ages of 18 and 45 who doesn't have a long-standing physical or mental health condition, and who isn't in what is described on the government website as an infrastructurally reliant field of work. Over the weekend, conscription raids across British towns and cities took place, with an estimated 27,000 men already taken for conscription purposes from all across the UK. Today, it is estimated that between 2 and 4 million people have stormed the capital in a massive protest against the government. However, there are real fears that this will be used to drag off even more fighting-aged British males for conscription. A large percentage of those marching today are mothers, grandmothers, wives, and daughters, scared that the men they love are going to be dragged off the streets and into a uniform in the dead of night. This comes as the first waves of British troops have begun to arrive in Eastern Europe as part of the coalition of the Willing's Brave plan to put a stop to the Ukraine war. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, believes the placement of Western troops in key locations in Ukraine will serve as a strong enough deterrent for the Russians to stop their war at the risk of a huge escalation. However, many across the British public believe that Starmer is using our armed forces as meat shields, putting them on the front lines of someone else's war to see if the Russian armed forces really have a conscience. No statement as of yet has been released by the American president regarding the conscription of British men into the armed forces. However, many hope that as the bastion of freedom in the world, the United States will manage somehow, some way to put a stop to it and reverse this act. Right now, the United States seems adamant to remain anti-interventionist. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin yesterday stated that the Western powers are right at the end of the line of Russian patience, with the leader saying, "I think they forget we have such a large nuclear arsenal. Escalation for them will only end one way, and I don't want to be the man who lays to ruin cities thousands of years old, but there comes a point where a man cannot be pushed further." This is the first time the Russian president has openly mentioned the Russian nuclear arsenal since the incident in Poland, leading many to believe that behind the scenes, the Russians are indeed preparing for the worst-case scenario, something we all wish to avoid. We have news to bring to you today that the Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has reached an agreement with Turkish President Recep Erdogan to station Royal Navy vessels at Turkish ports in the Black Sea, despite heavy protest from both the Russian and American governments. The Russian government has stated that the move is an example of the British government wanting a war to cover from its mismanagement of its circumstances at home, whilst the American government has stated surprisingly that the action is clearly going to be deemed as provocative, and if an attack was to be carried out on Royal Navy vessels in the Black Sea, it would have a just angle of explanation for Russia. Reports suggest that initially, around 20 Royal Navy vessels will be stationed in the Black Sea, including newer cutting-edge destroyers, and most importantly 2 of the UK's 4 nuclear Trident submarines. The presence of nuclear submarines in the Black Sea poses a real threat to Russia, as it allows the UK a nuclear strike capability at a moment's notice on almost any key Russian location. In response, we've seen that the Russian armed forces have begun to push with force towards the Ukrainian city of Sumy, where British and German forces are currently stationed. We've yet to see a meeting between the coalition forces stationed in Ukraine and the Russian forces. The closest so far was a series of drone strikes into Kiev where French forces were stationed, however no casualties were suffered. The tense situation in Eastern Europe continues to spiral. We hope a solution can be found soon and the situation can be diffused rapidly. In other news, American military reports are suggesting the People's Republic of China are beginning to build up a significant force around the cities of Quanzhou and Putian, areas which sit on the Taiwan Strait. Initial reports are mixed. Some suggest huge military build-ups, others suggest a routine training exercise could be taking place. However, significant American naval movement has been spotted around Hawaii, leading some to speculate that those within military circles are expecting a Chinese invasion of Taiwan to be edging closer.
This is the emergency alert system on behalf of His Majesty's government. Please stand by. This is the emergency alert system on behalf of His Majesty's government. At 6:35 a.m. this morning, the Russian armed forces reached the outskirts of the Ukrainian city of Sumy, where our military peacekeeping forces, as well as the German and Polish armed forces, are located. Military leaders present in the city extended the hand of communication to their Russian counterparts. Our position was made clear, as was our goal. We were not in the city of an offensive measure, but to ensure the safety of those citizens residing inside the city. The Russian commanders demanded our respective militaries withdraw, something which would go against both our goals in the region, but also the integrity of the British armed forces. We reinstated our goals in the area, and appealed to a peaceful resolution, to which the Russian commanders withdrew. Moments later, the city came under heavy artillery strikes. Supported by Russian drones and jets, the left side of the city began to be assaulted by Russian armored divisions, while Russian infantry began to press forwards into the suburbs of the city. Despite our best efforts, we were unable to avoid conflict. We assure you, the first shots were fired by the Russian troops in the region. Within moments, our armed forces, along with our allied forces and the Ukrainian armed forces in the city, began to rally and launch a defense of our position, firing back, inflicting heavy casualties on the first wave of approaching Russian forces. However, the overwhelming number of approaching Russian forces meant that our soldiers had to slowly tactically withdraw back further into the city. We now are engaged in a bloody door-to-door battle with the Russian military. Further afield, I can inform you that this attack came alongside a multitude of other assaults by the Russian military. We can confirm that Russian forces have launched an assault through the Baltic nations of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, predictably to link up with the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, from which Russian forces are also striking north into Lithuania, but also south into Poland. An assault from the territory of Belarus has also been made against the Polish, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian borders. Russian armored columns have begun to push into southern Finland with the clear goal of taking Helsinki, while Russian paratroopers have begun to drop behind the lines of the defenses established in northern Norway. The Russian Baltic fleet has begun to shell Swedish, Danish, and Finnish islands in the Baltic, as well as scattered shelling of German coastal cities, while in the Black Sea, Russian ships have begun to engage Royal Navy and Turkish naval positions while shelling Romanian, Turkish and Bulgarian positions along the coast. Russian mountaineers have also begun to skirmish with Georgian forces in the Caucasus. Due to such a wide-ranging assault, we believe that the assault on Sumy, and against our armed forces, was always planned, regardless of our response to the Russian demands. It is now with a heavy heart that we must inform you that Article 5 of the NATO alliance has formally been triggered. An attack on one is an attack on all. The Russian Federation has violently and deliberately attacked our alliance of nations, and this is something that cannot and must not stand. NATO stands for the freedom and independence of all nations from the tyranny of aggressive regimes, and thus we have no choice but to respond as individual sovereign nations, and as a unified front. It is now my duty to inform you that our nation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, is now at war with the Russian Federation. Several changes to daily life will be made over the coming days, starting within the hour. Keep tuned to radio and television broadcasts for updates. We require the general public to comply with the authorities during this time of great trial. We assure you we will do everything in our power to make sure this nation stays safe and secure. Further updates will be made once they become available. Thank you, stay safe. God save the King, God save our troops now engaging the enemy abroad, and God save the United Kingdom.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC's official wartime broadcast. We start today with news of the ongoing Russian assault in the north of Finland and Norway. Early this morning, Norwegian sources informed us that Russian paratroopers had begun to drop around the towns of Hessing and Kirkenes. Around 5 a.m., local Norwegian divisions came under fire from Russian air support, forcing them into cover, before spotters noticed the parachutes of Russian paratroopers beginning to unfurl above the area. The Norwegian forces in the area attempted to rally and fight off the landing. However, the Russian air support significantly hampered their efforts, and despite losses inflicted upon the Russians, they were able to land and establish a foothold behind the lines of the main Norwegian front lines, which range from Langebukt down to Vagatum. Hours of fighting have since ensued, with the Russians making slow but steady gains crossing the Norwegian border and attempting to link up with the currently cut-off Russian paratroopers. Currently, the Russians have failed to push into the northern areas of Finland as a stubborn defense has remained solid despite repeated artillery strikes from approaching Russian troops. Further south, a significant Russian armored advance is making gains in their approach towards the Finnish capital of Helsinki. An unusually large gathering of Russian armor struck moments after the war began across the Finnish border and rapidly began advancing with the clear goal of the capture of the Finnish capital. Finnish forces have been fighting with vigor and determination, but significantly larger Russian numbers have caused a large breakthrough in the south. So far, the Russians still remain a significant distance from Helsinki. However, keeping this current pace, experts estimate that they could arrive at the outskirts of the city by Christmas Day. Allied forces, including British and German troops, are rumored to be on their way to Helsinki to bolster the defense of the city in preparation for the predicted Russian attack. However, Finnish forces will be hopeful that they can bring the Russian advance to a stop before a battle for the capital begins. In the Gulf of Finland, significant naval engagements are taking place between Royal Navy and Deutsche Marine vessels clashing with the Russian Baltic fleet. Currently, there seems to be a stalemate forming with the British and German ships successfully stopping the Russian Navy from approaching the coastal regions of Helsinki. If the Allied navies could significantly damage the Russian Baltic fleet in these engagements, it would provide a huge moral boost to the war effort as it would allow NATO a significant amount of control in the Baltic Sea. There are other clashes in the Baltic currently going on as small Russian strike groups have been harassing the Polish, German, Danish, Swedish, and Baltic coasts throughout the Baltic Sea, as well as attempted landings on islands within the Baltic. However, they have yet proved to be unsuccessful. In the Baltics, the Russians and Belarusians initially made good ground advancing into the countries of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, before a rallied response from several NATO nations and the Baltic states managed to stabilize the front and grind the advance to a halt. In small select zones, the Russians specifically seem to still be advancing slowly. However, the majority of the front seems to be holding firm. A combined air force of British, Polish, German, American, and Baltic planes has managed to battle air superiority away from the Russians, securing the safety of the skies above the Allied troops engaging in a nasty ground war with the Russian forces. Allied armor is stationed around Tallinn in Estonia, which has been labeled as a city at risk due to the advancing Russian forces around Narva. A combined army of British, American, and Estonian forces are setting up in-depth defenses around the Estonian capital, as well as the stationing of significant armored divisions in the area. The retention of a NATO capital city on the Baltic Sea is seen as a crucial goal for the alliance, with its potential loss causing great mental concern to the Allied leadership. Currently, the NATO forces in the region are still outnumbered by the advancing Russians. However, more and more fresh troops are being mobilized across Europe, and the hope is that fresh divisions will be able to be created and thrust into battle within 2 weeks. The quality of these divisions, however, would be questionable as the government's controversial conscription plan continues to ramp up. The existing veteran corps of the British Army is stretched across Europe, filling in gaps and lines across the continent, similar to both the German and the French militaries respectively. Senior leadership believes that despite the rushed nature of the mobilization, NATO's new compressed training regime will be an effective countermeasure to the relative inexperience of the new fresh and green divisions across the continent. As for the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, a huge assault by NATO forces around the entire territory is currently taking place with the goal of the complete capture of the Russian territory. The Russians stationed significant numbers in the territory before the war started, meaning the planned capture is taking a lot longer than expected, as well as casualty numbers being much higher also than previously imagined. The main front stretches an astonishing 870 kilometers, or around 540 miles, from deep inside Poland to the east of Ukraine as a huge multinational NATO army battles alongside the Ukrainians against the main force of the Russian and Belarusian armies. Several sections of the front are currently fluid and mobile, including the front around Kharkiv where NATO forces rush in to reinforce the long-standing Ukrainian defense force holding the city. NATO commanders are confident that several areas of Belarus may be targeted for breakthroughs and encirclements, with the training level of the Belarusian troops deemed inferior to that of the more seasoned Russian forces, which are fast becoming stretched across the entire front. Due to this, however, we understand that a mass forced conscription drive is currently taking place all across Russia, with millions of men being called up to serve in the military in some form. As a response, we understand that the governments of Britain, Germany, and Poland are expanding their conscription laws to include 17-year-olds and up to fit and able 48-year-olds, accessing a wider-ranging pool of men to fight in the war if needed. Casualty numbers are yet to be determined only a few days in, however. Some believe that upwards of 100,000 men could have already become casualties of the war across Europe only a few days in, leading to huge protests from women across the continent who see this war as a waste of the lives of their loved ones. The British Armed Forces have informed the BBC that it currently has a known casualty list of around 9,000 men either killed in action, injured in action, or missing in action. Our thoughts are with the families of our brave servicemen who have fallen defending the freedom of us at home and many across the continent. NATO intelligence has identified a large gathering of Russian armor around the Ukrainian city of Chernihiv, leading commanders to believe a huge assault towards the Ukrainian capital of Kiev is being planned by the Russian armed forces. Due to this, a large-scale defense force of primarily French and Spanish troops have been gathering within the Ukrainian city, which is currently being subjected to a constant bombardment from long-range artillery, missile strikes and drone strikes. The retention of cities as important as Kiev is the absolute priority of the NATO forces, not just for the infrastructural and transport links which make providing reinforcements and supplies to the troops fighting a much easier task, but also for the moral importance for the troops fighting on the ground. More updates from the main front will be provided when developments become available. In further news, Russian special forces and mountaineers have crossed the borders of Georgia and Azerbaijan despite heavy fighting from the native forces. The Caucasus are the far edge of NATO's European reach and is the region where Allied troops are the most scarce. Despite this, the Georgians and Azerbaijanis are fighting hard against the approaching Russian forces. Interestingly, the traditional ally of the Russian Federation, Armenia, is currently having a crisis of conscience due to a demand made by the Russian government to hand over sovereign control of their nation to the Russians. An historic enemy of both the Turks and the Azerbaijanis, the Armenians were expected to take the side of the Russians. However, no conflict has occurred across the shared borders with the NATO powers and NATO ally of Azerbaijan, leading NATO negotiators to establish contact with the government of Armenia in an attempt to wrestle them away from the influence of the Russians in the region. If the Armenians could be persuaded to side against the Russians in this conflict, it would be a huge win for the NATO alliance, as it would allow a clean front across the entire Caucasus region against the Russians. The politics of the region does still pose a threat, however, as mentioned previously. The Armenians are historic rivals of the Turks and the Azerbaijanis in the region, and so it is no guarantee that they will extend their hand to the NATO powers. Across the Black Sea, the Russian Navy has been harassing the coast of Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania while also engaging with NATO vessels within the Black Sea. The Royal Navy ships stationed on the Turkish coast have been engaging heavily with Russian ships in the region with the aim of gaining naval supremacy, similar to the Baltic Sea. If a significant victory in the Black Sea can be established, it would allow NATO to extend their strikes deep into mainland Russia, as well as supporting the Ukrainians in their reclamation of the territory currently occupied by the Russian forces. No clear winner in this battle has currently emerged. However, we understand that the NATO navies in the region are confident that they can strike a significant blow to the Russians, freeing up some of the burden on the Ukrainians and Georgians in the region. We currently have no news on the 2 British nuclear Trident submarines known to be present within the Black Sea.
This is the emergency alert system on behalf of His Majesty's government. Please stand by. This is the emergency alert system on behalf of His Majesty's government. We are currently tracking a series of missiles launched by Russian submarines in the North Sea heading for locations across the coast of England. We believe those locations include Hull, Grimsby, Bridlington, Scarborough, Whitby, Middlesbrough, and Hartlepool. We expect the missiles to strike within the coming minutes. Currently the Home Fleet is rallying and heading to the approximate location, which the missiles were fired from to attempt to locate and eliminate the Russian submarines. This is an official shelter warning. You are advised to shelter in place now if you are present in any location mentioned. These missiles are not believed to be nuclear, but ballistic. They still possess the power to cause significant damage. We believe they are targeting our crucial shipping ports. We currently have anti-air systems being activated across the coast in an attempt to intercept these missiles. However, we cannot guarantee success. Please, find shelter now. Seek a place of safety now. If you are outside in the affected areas, seek a structurally sound building. If you have access to a cellar or basement, take shelter inside. If you have the materials to quickly barricade the entrances, do so with haste. If you are above ground level, get down to ground level. These missiles have the ability to level buildings. If a building collapses with you higher than the ground floor, the odds of survival are extremely low. Seek shelter now. Seek a place of safety now. The emergency services will rush to the affected locations once the crisis is over. Strike imminent, prepare. 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 This is the emergency alert system on behalf of His Majesty's government. This is the all clear. The danger has now passed. We tracked 18 missiles heading for the coast of England. Our anti-air defenses managed to intercept 6 missiles, however, 12 managed to evade our systems and have struck across the coast. The amount of damage caused is currently unknown, however, we do believe that significant damage has been done, especially to our Hull port facilities. Despite our all clear, we would still advise citizens in the affected areas to stay within your safe places of shelter for the next 15 to 20 minutes, while staying tuned to our broadcasts in case a repeat strike is launched. We believe the danger may have passed as our Home Fleet is now patrolling the approximate location from which the missiles were fired, and we currently have found no submarines present, leading us to believe that they have evacuated the area in a hit-and-run attack. Local emergency services are currently en route to the impact sites to help with destruction and injury. If you or anyone you know has been caught in the blast and seek medical attention, call the Wartime Medical Emergency Line on 993. This will put you through to our rapid response medical teams dealing with war casualties on our home territory. We thank you for your patience during this crisis, and we hope you made it through without injury. This concludes the use of the emergency alert system.
We have breaking news, and it is sending specifically American military circles into overdrive. The Chinese President Xi Jinping has announced that 3 days from now, the People's Republic of China will begin its quote reunification process with Taiwan. Many believe the timing of this to be extremely interesting, as it comes just as the United States of America is beginning to ramp up its transport of soldiers and military supplies to Europe. President Xi has long stated his goal to reunite China and Taiwan under one banner, and long have the Americans pledged to defend the independence of the Taiwanese people from the threat of the People's Republic of China. For this decision to be announced ahead of time puts the United States in a tough spot. Despite their enormous production capacity and their huge military, even the United States may struggle to fight a fully fledged two-front war against Russia in Europe with NATO and the Chinese in the Pacific with the Taiwanese. North Korean posturing has also been increasing recently, and the threat to South Korea and Japan will also be worrying the Americans. We understand that the American Pacific Fleet has begun to assemble around Hawaii already, and troops and equipment bound for Europe have now been halted in their transport and redirected across the nation towards California. NATO will hope that the United States sticks to their initial plan and begins to reinforce the lines in Eastern Europe, as the European NATO powers have been losing tons of men in an horrifically attritional war with the Russians over the past week, and with the Russian advance towards Warsaw still a threat, any additional help would be greatly appreciated on the front lines. In other news, the Russians have made a significant breakthrough in the north of Norway and Finland. It came as NATO troops were reshuffled across the front lines in Europe to attempt to restabilize some of the bulges the Russians had been cutting in the Baltic and Poland. The Russians have now cut off a significant amount of the Norwegian army around the village of Tanna, and they risk being pushed into the sea by advancing Spetsnaz special forces units in the region. The Swedish military has rushed units north to fill in the blank spaces as another unified front line across multiple nations becomes a reality. However, the Russians are pushing forward with momentum and will look to capitalize as much as possible on the disorganized nature of the lines in the north. Mentioned earlier, the Russians have begun to cut deep into the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as well as expanding their attempted assault towards Warsaw in Poland. Military experts have just told the BBC that the entire NATO frontline is currently in a huge sense of disarray, as a whole range of planned offensives, defensive reshuffles, resupply trips, and more have had to be scrapped due to the American decision to hold back from Europe due to the situation in China. The change of plans apparently caused NATO higher-ups to rush through new plans as the Russians began attacking, causing long-held stable front lines to become unstuck, and forcing divisions into tactical withdrawals across the board. It is now estimated that Russia controls around 65% of the three Baltic nations and has gained several more miles in its push towards Warsaw. Allied air power is still a strong force in the regions and is thought to have delayed the advance by the Russians significantly. However, the rushed and last-minute plans enabled by NATO have caused mass confusion, which the Russians have capitalized upon. The hope is that fresh divisions from several NATO member states can be rushed to the front lines to shore up the holes forming and slow down the Russian advance enough that new plans can be implemented to regain the lost territories. We also understand that a formal plan for Russia to absorb the state of Belarus is being discussed internally. Whether this will be accepted by the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko is unclear. However, this is yet another example of the expansionist goals of the Russian dictator, Vladimir Putin. We have huge breaking news that France has launched a series of tactical nuclear strikes against Russian troop concentrations inside Belarus. I repeat, France has detonated tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus against the Russian army. This is the first time since 1945 that nuclear weapons have been deployed against an enemy force, and this takes us to a place where no one wanted to go. We can confirm now that 3 cities in Belarus were struck. They are Brest, Baranavichi, and Rodna. We currently have no information on the yield of these nuclear strikes, but we can confirm they have struck their targets. We have just received a response from the French government. It goes as follows: today, after deep discussions with several different NATO member states, we decided to utilize to our full ability the power of our nuclear arsenal against the Russian forces gathering in Belarus. Over the past weeks, we have been fighting a losing battle. Our lines have continuously fallen back, and in a lot of places we are fighting the war on our own soil. This must stop. We identified several locations with significant Russian troop and equipment concentrations and decided, along with the approval of senior NATO leaders, that limited tactical nuclear strikes on these locations could and would cripple a large proportion of Russia's offensive capability on the European front. Since the strikes hit, we have already witnessed the disarray forming within the Russian ranks, and at several points across the lines we've managed to regain territory from the aggressors. We understand the risk we have taken with these strikes, but we assure you they were limited, tactical, and only taken with the approval of all the right people within the ranks of NATO. This is a war we must win, and we will. That was a quote released on behalf of the French government and military. We can now confirm that the Russian government has released a response to the strikes today. That statement goes as follows: "Today the West showed the true face of their alliance. We understand the French launched 6 tactical nuclear missiles at Russian positions within Belarus. Tens of thousands of Russian and Belarusian soldiers and civilians lie dead due to the war-mongering actions of the French government with the approval of the other NATO powers. Russia now reserves the right to defend herself by any means necessary. The West opened this box. It is not on the Russian conscience now what emerges. We're now just receiving the first image of the mushroom cloud forming above the city of Rodna, Belarus, as a result of the French nuclear strikes which took place earlier today. An absolutely horrifying image. Hang on a moment, please." We are receiving reports that Russian nuclear strikes have struck Ukrainian positions around Kiev as well as Polish and Allied positions behind the lines around Warsaw. We're just confirming this. Please hold on. Okay, we have confirmation. Several Russian nuclear missiles have struck around Kiev and Warsaw, evidently as a retaliatory strike by the Russians against NATO. We're currently waiting for official news on the casualties from these strikes.
This is the United Kingdom's NAP system. NAP is short for Nuclear Alert Programme, and is a subroutine of the Emergency Alert System on behalf of His Majesty's Government. The Nuclear Alert Programme is activated when the possibility of a nuclear exchange involving this nation is at a heightened risk. This programme will deliver the latest news on the nuclear exchanges around the world, and if the worst happens, will give the British public forewarning before an attack occurs on British soil. Currently, there is an ongoing nuclear exchange in Eastern Europe between the NATO alliance and the Russian Federation. Previously, you were informed of nuclear strikes between the French and the Russians. We can now confirm that the number of nuclear strikes, which have taken place around the front lines in Eastern Europe, stands at 37 and counting. These strikes seem to be solely tactical strikes against troop concentrations on both sides. We understand that British troops have been caught in several of these blasts. Casualty numbers are currently unknown, and will be broadcast once information becomes available. Alert! We can confirm that the People's Republic of China has struck the American Pacific Fleet with a series of tactical nuclear missiles around Taiwan. Currently, the damage is unknown. I repeat, the American Pacific Fleet around Taiwan has been struck with multiple nuclear missiles. Alert! The nuclear exchange in Eastern Europe is escalating fast. We understand that around 50 nuclear strikes have been detected. The countries affected are thought to be Belarus, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and Azerbaijan. The government has now upgraded my readiness level to imminent. Imminent means that a nuclear attack against this nation is highly likely, and you should begin to prepare. First, seek shelter in a sturdy location, preferably a cellar or basement. If neither are available, a small enclosed room with thick walls is a good option. Begin to cover all entrances to the outside world. Make sure windows and doors are sealed and barricaded. This is to stop the possibility of nuclear fallout entering your shelter. You should layer these with fabrics, such as towels and duvets, to act as makeshift filters for air. This won't be perfect, but is a good shot in a rush. You should gather as much water as possible. Fill any and all containers with water. Water will be needed for drinking, washing, cooking, cleaning, and more. It is crucial that you have an ample amount of water available. Stock up on tinned and long-lasting food. In the event of a nuclear attack, you will be required to stay inside your shelter for at least 2 weeks while the radiation levels drop. Make sure you have enough food for an extended period of isolation. Gather all medication and medical supplies and bring them to your allocated shelter. If you are outside, get inside immediately. Find a sturdy building and shelter there now. The outside is no longer safe and is at high risk of nuclear attack. If you are caught outside during a nuclear strike, your chances of survival are low. You must seek shelter now. Find warm clothing and blankets. Nuclear war can create ash thick enough to block out the sun, making the surrounding area extremely cold. Make sure you have a battery-powered radio and torch, with extra batteries in case of emergency. Candles and matches are also important items to possess during this possible crisis. Sanitary products are important to staying healthy, as war can and will knock out hygiene systems. Illnesses can spread rapidly. If you have the supplies to take care of your pets, gather them and bring them into the shelter with you. If not, you will have to leave your pets to fend for themselves. In a nuclear war, survival is key. Ensuring an animal's welfare will be detrimental to your survival. As sad as it seems, you must put yourself and your family first if you wish to survive. Alert! American nuclear strikes have impacted Chinese assets in the Pacific Ocean. I repeat, American nuclear strikes have struck Chinese vessels and makeshift islands in the Pacific. Alert! North Korea has struck Tokyo with a nuclear missile. This is the first strike on a civilian target. This indicates that an escalation is now likely. Alert! The government has upgraded my readiness level to definite. Definite means a nuclear strike will almost definitely hit this nation. You must be prepared now. Everyone must be in their shelter and prepare for attack. The United Kingdom will soon come under nuclear attack. Alert! Capitals across Europe have begun to be struck by Russian nuclear missiles. We can confirm that Warsaw, Berlin, Paris, Madrid, Lisbon, Rome, Ankara, Athens, and Bucharest have been struck by nuclear missiles. Take cover now. Get to your shelters now. Alert! China and the United States of America are engaging in a global nuclear exchange. I repeat, the Chinese and Americans are engaging in a global nuclear exchange. We understand that hundreds of nuclear missiles are currently being fired by both powers. Stand by. Warning, warning. A nuclear attack against the United Kingdom is currently underway. Seek shelter now. Seek a place of safety now. We repeat, the United Kingdom is under attack. Nuclear missiles launched from the Russian Federation are on their way towards the United Kingdom. Seek shelter now. Seek a place of safety now. We are tracking over 200 nuclear missiles currently on course to hit this country. Seek shelter now. We can confirm that the following cities will be struck: London, Bournemouth, Southampton, Plymouth, Bristol, Cardiff, Swansea, Birmingham, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester, Norwich, Leeds, Sheffield, Rotherham, Coventry, Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, Inverness, Belfast. Many more will also be struck. Our anti-air systems are currently online and attempting to intercept the incoming strikes. However, many will still get through. By now you should be in your shelter prepared for the strikes. If not, get inside now, seek shelter now, seek a place of safety now. The United Kingdom is under nuclear attack from the Russian Federation. Updated tracking suggests 324 missiles are approaching the United Kingdom at speed. The world is currently undergoing a global nuclear exchange. I repeat, the world is currently engaging in nuclear war. The entire globe will be affected. All nuclear powers are firing their arsenals. We understand that the United States is currently being struck by hundreds of Chinese nuclear missiles. Strike imminent. 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 Strike imminent.
This is the emergency alert system on behalf of His Majesty's government. We understand that the strikes have now stopped, and the damage can now be calculated. We cannot obtain contact with any other nation. We can barely gain contact with Scotland, and have no contact with Wales. In the end, the United Kingdom was struck 407 times with nuclear missiles. From what we can observe, there isn't a village or city that isn't affected. The levels of radiation outside are extremely high, higher than we ever believed in our simulations. Those of you who are still alive, we estimate at least a month in your shelters will be needed before outside exposure becomes acceptable in limited doses. However, there will remain areas of high radiation. The cities of London, Birmingham, Sheffield and Manchester have been wiped off the map. The destruction is apocalyptic. Smaller cities like Nottingham, Coventry and Bristol have still suffered devastating damage, but seem more likely to hold survivors in their depths. Our simulations estimate that up to 50 million across the United Kingdom may have perished already, with many more to follow. We believe that if the world ever recovers, the population of the United Kingdom, when it is safe to emerge once more, may be around 200,000. Maybe even less than that. We believe that across the world, over 4 billion may have died, and again, once the fallout and the smog clears, we believe that less than 30 million worldwide will remain, possibly much, much less than that. Most likely much less than that. Despite this destruction, we must alert you of something. Around an hour ago, we received a faint, but present transmission from a group of Royal Marines who were fighting around Tallinn, Estonia, when the bombs fell. They are still alive. This means more of our brave men may be alive out there, spread across the world. This shows the strength and determination of our people, that despite nuclear hellfire, our warriors remain victorious. To salute their bravery, and to claim victory in this world-ending conflict, we will now play the national anthem for all those who died fighting this war.
Hello. This is David Miller, member of the Mercian Regiment, former British Army, and now member of the Sherwood Safe Zone. Is anyone out there?
We read you, David. This is Sergeant Michael Harlow of the Washington, D.C. National Guard Remnant, based out of Fort Leslie. Nice to know you Brits are still kicking over there.